The tears on Elizabeth Walker's cheeks reflected the soft glow of candles as she sat alone in the abandoned church on the outskirts of Cottonwood Springs, Wyoming Territory, 1879. Her shoulders shook with each quiet sob, the sound echoing in the empty wooden structure that had once hosted a congregation before the silver mine dried up, and most folks moved on to more promising lands. The creaking of the church door made Elizabeth hastily wipe her tears, but she didn't turn around. Heavy boots thudded against the wooden floor, followed by the jingle of spurs. The footsteps paused, then continued until they reached her pew. A tall figure slid onto the bench beside her, leaving a respectful distance between them. "Don't reckon I've seen a prettier church, even if it is a bit worse for wear," said a deep voice with a gentle southern drawl. Elizabeth kept her gaze fixed on her lap where her hands clutched a crumpled letter. "It's abandoned like everything else in this town. Abandoned things still have value," the stranger replied. "Sometimes they just need someone to see it." She finally looked up at the man. He was perhaps 30, with sun-weathered skin and kind eyes the color of whiskey. His dark hair fell in waves beneath a well-worn Stetson, and a thin scar ran along his jawline. He wasn't handsome in the conventional sense, but there was something compelling about his face. "Quincy Blackwood," he introduced himself with a slight tip of his hat. "Most folks call me Quinn." "Elizabeth Walker," she responded automatically, then added, "though I suppose it doesn't matter now, I'll be gone tomorrow." Quinn's expression didn't change, but his eyes studied her with unexpected intensity. "Gone where, if you don't mind my asking?" "Anywhere but here." Elizabeth gestured vaguely at the church around them. "There's nothing left for me in Cottonwood Springs." Quinn nodded slowly, his gaze shifting to the letter in her hands. "Bad news," Elizabeth laughed bitterly. "My fiancé. He's decided Wyoming is too wild for a Boston gentleman like himself. Says he can't possibly bring his delicate flower to such uncivilized territory." She crumpled the letter tighter. 4 years of correspondence, and he couldn't even tell me to my face. Just sent this letter with the stagecoach driver. Quinn was quiet for a moment. "His loss," he finally said, his voice soft but certain. "I believe in you, Miss Walker." Elizabeth's head snapped up. "What did you say?" "I said I believe in you." Quinn's gaze was steady, his expression earnest. "Don't know you well, but I recognize strength when I see it. A woman who'd come all this way on a promise has more backbone than most men I've known." "You don't understand," Elizabeth whispered, fresh tears threatening. "I have nowhere to go. I sold everything to come here. My teaching position, my mother's silver, everything." Quinn removed his hat and set it on the pew beside him. "Then stay," he said simply. "Cottonwood Springs might be dying, but it ain't dead yet. I just bought the old Bradley Ranch outside town, planning to raise horses." "What does that have to do with me?" "Town needs a teacher. Children deserve schooling even in a place like this." Elizabeth shook her head. "There's no school here anymore." "There's this church," Quinn countered. "Needs some work, but it could serve until something better comes along. You don't even know if I'm a good teacher." A small smile touched Quinn's lips. "Are you?" Despite herself, Elizabeth felt a flicker of pride. "The best in my district back in Boston. Then those children need you." Quinn stood and placed his hat back on his head. "Think on it. I've got a room at Mrs. Holloway's boarding house if you want to talk more." He hesitated, then added, "Sometimes what looks like an ending is just the start of something better." As he walked away, his spurs jingling with each step, Elizabeth found herself watching him go. For the first time since opening that devastating letter, she felt something other than despair, a tiny spark of possibility. "Mr. Blackwood," she called after him. He turned, silhouetted in the doorway by the setting sun. "Yes, Miss Walker. Why do you care what happens to me or this town?" Quinn's expression softened. "Everyone deserves someone who believes in them, especially when they're sitting alone in an empty church." With that, he was gone, leaving Elizabeth to ponder his words as the last rays of sunlight filtered through the dusty, stained glass, painting the abandoned church in hues of gold and amber. The next morning, Elizabeth stood outside Mrs. Holloway's boarding house, her carpetbag clutched in one hand. She'd spent a restless night weighing her options, which were admittedly few. The stagecoach would be leaving at noon, but the thought of returning east in disgrace made her stomach churn. She had no family waiting, no position to reclaim. All she had was her pride and the meager savings she'd managed to keep aside for emergencies. The boarding house door opened, and Quinn Blackwood emerged, adjusting his hat against the bright morning sun. He stopped short when he saw her. "Miss Walker," he said, surprise evident in his voice. "I thought you'd be preparing for your departure." Elizabeth lifted her chin. "I've been considering your suggestion about teaching." A slow smile spread across Quinn's face. "Have you now?" "Yes, but I have conditions." Elizabeth straightened her shoulders. "I'll need proper supplies, books, slates, chalk, and the church will need repairs before it can serve as a schoolhouse." Quinn leaned against the porch railing. "Sounds reasonable. And I'll need a place to live, somewhere respectable. Mrs. Holloway has a room available. She'd be pleased to have another lady in the house." Elizabeth nodded, then took a deep breath. "There's one more thing. I need to know why you're really doing this. Why help a stranger?" Quinn's expression grew thoughtful. "When I was a boy, my ma died of fever. Pa took to drinking and I was headed for trouble, but there was a teacher who saw something in me. She convinced me I could be more than just another ranch hand or drifter." He paused, his eyes meeting Elizabeth's. "She believed in me when no one else did, changed the course of my life." Elizabeth felt something stir within her, a connection, an understanding. "What happened to her?" A shadow crossed Quinn's face. "Consumption took her when I was 15, but by then she'd already saved me." He straightened up. "So you see, Miss Walker, I know the difference one good teacher can make." The honesty in his voice touched her. "I still don't know if this is wise." "Most important decisions rarely are," Quinn replied with a gentle smile. "But I promise you this: if you stay, you won't be alone in rebuilding this place." "Then I'll stay," Elizabeth decided, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "At least until the end of summer. If there aren't enough children to teach by then, I'll reconsider." Quinn's face lit up with a genuine smile that transformed his features, making him almost handsome. "That's fair. Now, shall we go see about that church?" Over the next 2 weeks, Elizabeth watched in amazement as Quinn marshaled the remaining townsfolk to help restore the church. What had seemed like a dying town revealed itself to have a stubborn pulse after all. The general store owner, Mr. Peterson, donated lumber. The blacksmith, a burly man named Samuel, repaired broken hinges and fashioned new brackets for the bell. Even Mrs. Holloway contributed curtains she'd been saving for a special occasion. Quinn worked alongside them all, his strong hands moving with surprising deftness as he replaced rotted floorboards and mended the sagging steps. Elizabeth found herself watching him more often than she cared to admit, drawn to his quiet competence and the gentle way he spoke to everyone, from the oldest widow to the youngest child. "You're staring again," observed Olivia, Mrs. Holloway's 16-year-old niece, as they hung the freshly washed curtains. Elizabeth felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I'm merely supervising the work." Olivia grinned knowingly. "If you say so, Miss Walker, but if I were supervising, I might look at the roof occasionally instead of just Mr. Blackwood's arms." "Olivia," Elizabeth scolded, though she couldn't help but laugh. "That's hardly appropriate." "But it's true," the girl persisted. "And he looks at you too, you know, when you're reading to the little ones or writing on that slate you brought. His eyes go all soft." Elizabeth's heart gave a traitorous flutter which she promptly suppressed. "Mr. Blackwood is simply being kind. He feels responsible for convincing me to stay." "If you say so," Olivia repeated, clearly unconvinced. "But my aunt says he's never taken this much interest in town matters before." "Not until you arrived." Before Elizabeth could formulate a response, Quinn himself appeared in the doorway, his shirt damp with sweat from working in the summer heat. "Ladies," he greeted them, tipping his hat. "The bell's back in the tower. Samuel says it should ring clear across the valley now." "That's wonderful news," Elizabeth replied, conscious of Olivia's amused glance. Perhaps we should test it, Quinn's eyes crinkled at the corners. I was hoping you'd say that. They climbed the narrow steps to the bell tower together, with Olivia trailing behind them. The wooden stairs creaked under their weight, but held firm, a testament to the quality of Quinn's repairs. The view from the tower took Elizabeth's breath away. From this height, she could see beyond the small cluster of buildings that formed Cottonwood Springs to the vast, rolling landscape beyond. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks still capped with snow despite the summer heat. Closer, the land was a patchwork of greens and golds, with the silver ribbon of a creek winding through it. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Quinn stood beside her, their shoulders almost touching. "Best view in the territory, thought you might appreciate it." "Which one is your ranch?" Elizabeth asked, suddenly curious about where this enigmatic man made his home. Quinn pointed to the northeast, where a cluster of buildings sat nestled in a valley. "Bradley Place, about 4 miles out. Got a good stream running through it and enough grazing land for the horses I'm planning to raise. It looks peaceful." "It is." Quinn's voice held a note of pride. "Worked 10 years to save enough to buy it, worth every callus and broken bone." Elizabeth glanced at him, noting the quiet satisfaction in his expression. "You must be very proud." "Getting there," he admitted. "Still a lot of work to do, but dreams take time." Their eyes met, and for a moment, Elizabeth felt something pass between them, an understanding, a shared sense of building something from nothing. The moment was broken when Olivia cleared her throat. "Are we going to ring the bell or just stand here all day?" Quinn chuckled and moved to the large rope hanging from the center of the bell. "Would you like to do the honors, Miss Walker?" Elizabeth stepped forward and grasped the thick rope. It felt rough against her palms as she pulled downward with all her strength. Above them, the bell swung and then, with a clear, resonant tone, rang out across Cottonwood Springs. The sound seemed to hang in the air, vibrating through the wooden structure and out into the world beyond. Elizabeth felt it in her chest, a tangible reminder that she was here, that she had chosen to stay, to build something new from the ashes of her disappointment. Quinn's hand came to rest briefly on her shoulder. "Welcome to Cottonwood Springs, Miss Walker," he said softly. "Officially." And in that moment, with the bell's echo still resonating around them and Quinn's warm presence beside her, Elizabeth knew she had made the right choice. The first day of school arrived with an unexpected flurry of activity. Elizabeth had hoped for perhaps a dozen students. There were, after all, only about 30 families remaining in and around Cottonwood Springs. To her astonishment, 27 children of various ages gathered in the newly restored church that Monday morning, their faces scrubbed clean and their best clothes donned for the occasion. Parents lingered in the doorway, curious about the Boston woman who had decided to stay and teach their children. Elizabeth felt their scrutiny as she arranged her small collection of books on the makeshift desk Quinn had constructed for her. "Nervous," came a familiar voice. Elizabeth turned to find Quinn leaning against the back wall, his hat in his hands. "A little," she admitted. "I didn't expect so many. Word travels fast out here. Families from outlying homesteads heard about the new school. Some of these children rode 5 miles to get here this morning." The responsibility of that settled on Elizabeth's shoulders. "I hope I don't disappoint them." Quinn's eyes held that same steady belief she'd first seen in the empty church. "You won't." With a nod of encouragement, he slipped out, leaving Elizabeth to face her new pupils. She took a deep breath, smoothed her skirts, and stepped to the front of the room. "Good morning," she began, her voice clear and confident despite her inner trepidation. "My name is Miss Walker, and I am very pleased to be your teacher." A sea of faces looked back at her, some eager, some wary, all attentive. Elizabeth launched into her carefully prepared introduction, explaining her background and outlining her expectations. As she spoke, she moved among the rows of benches, making eye contact with each child. "Education is not just about learning facts," she told them. "It's about learning to think, to question, to understand the world around you. In this classroom, we will respect each other's ideas, even when we disagree. By mid-morning, Elizabeth had organized the children into groups based on their previous schooling. Some of the older boys had never attended school before, while a few of the younger children showed surprising literacy thanks to parents who had prioritized home learning. At noon, she dismissed them for lunch, watching as they spilled out into the churchyard with the boundless energy of youth. She sank into her chair, suddenly exhausted but exhilarated. She had done it, she had begun to build something here. "Looks like a success to me," said a voice from the doorway. Elizabeth looked up to see Quinn standing there, holding a small basket. "They're wonderful children," she replied, unable to keep the enthusiasm from her voice. "Eager to learn, most of them." Even the Sullivan boys, though they tried to look uninterested. Quinn laughed. "Jack Sullivan told those boys they'd better mind you or they'd answer to him. He wants them to have the education he never got." He approached her desk and set down the basket. "Brought you some lunch. Figured you might be too busy to remember to eat." Elizabeth was touched by the thoughtfulness. "Thank you, that's very kind," Quinn shrugged, seeming almost embarrassed by her gratitude. "Just being neighborly. Besides, can't have our teacher fainting from hunger on her first day." Elizabeth opened the basket to find fresh bread, cheese, and apples, along with a jar of preserved peaches. "This is lovely, but far too much for just me. Will you join me?" Something flickered in Quinn's eyes, surprise, perhaps, or pleasure. "If you're sure I'm not intruding on your peaceful break from all those youngsters." "Not at all." Elizabeth gestured to one of the student benches. "Though I'm afraid the seating isn't designed for someone of your height." Quinn folded his long frame onto the bench with good-natured awkwardness. "I've sat in worse places." As they shared the simple meal, Elizabeth found herself relaxing in Quinn's company. There was something comforting about his presence, a steadiness that made her feel secure. "Tell me about your ranch," she prompted, curious to know more about him. "You mentioned raising horses." Quinn's face lit up with enthusiasm. "Quarter horses, mainly. Good stock for ranch work. I've got 6 mares and a stallion to start with, and 2 of the mares are in foal." "That sounds like quite an undertaking for one man." "Hired a hand to help young fellow named Diego, good with horses, and I've got a dog, Blue, who's worth his weight in gold when it comes to herding." Elizabeth smiled at his obvious passion. "You love it, don't you? The ranch life." Quinn considered this as he took a bite of bread. "Love isn't a word I use lightly," he said after a moment. "But yes, I suppose I do love it, the freedom of it, the challenge, building something that's mine." "I understand that feeling," Elizabeth said softly. "It's how I feel about teaching." Their eyes met, and Elizabeth felt that same connection she'd experienced in the bell tower, a recognition of kindred spirits. The moment was interrupted by the church door banging open as the children began to return from lunch. Quinn rose, gathering the remains of their meal back into the basket. "I should let you get back to your pupils," he said. "But perhaps you'd consider coming out to the ranch this weekend. Could show you the horses, might be educational." Elizabeth found herself nodding before she'd fully considered the propriety of such a visit. "I'd like that very much." Quinn's smile made her heart beat a little faster. "I'll send Diego with the wagon on Saturday morning if that suits." "Yes, that would be fine." As Quinn left with a tip of his hat, Elizabeth turned her attention back to her students, but part of her mind remained fixed on the coming Saturday and the chance to see more of Quinn Blackwood's world. Saturday dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect late summer day that seemed designed for outings. Elizabeth dressed with particular care, choosing a practical but becoming blue calico dress that wouldn't show dust from the ride. She pinned her hair up securely, knowing the Wyoming wind would try its best to disarrange it. Mrs. Holloway watched her preparations with knowing eyes. "Mr. Blackwood's ranch, is it? Quite an invitation for a woman you've known barely a month." Elizabeth felt a blush creep up her neck. "It's merely an educational visit. I've been teaching the children about local industries, and Mr. Blackwood kindly offered to show me his horse breeding operation." was Mrs. Holloway's only response, though her raised eyebrow spoke volumes. At precisely 9 o'clock, a wagon pulled up outside the boarding house. The driver was a young Hispanic man with a friendly smile. "Miss Walker," he called. "I am Diego Mendoza. Mr. Blackwood sent me to bring you to the ranch." Elizabeth settled herself in the wagon, her heart beating a little faster in anticipation. The journey took about an hour, winding through stunning landscape that shifted from the dry scrubland near town to greener pastures as they approached Quinn's property. The Bradley Ranch, or Blackwood Ranch now, Elizabeth supposed was larger than it had appeared from the church tower. A sturdy main house of weathered wood stood alongside a large barn and several smaller outbuildings. A corral contained several horses who lifted their heads with interest as the wagon approached. Quinn emerged from the barn as they pulled up, wiping his hands on a cloth. He wore no jacket, just a blue cotton shirt with the sleeves rolled up to reveal tanned, muscular forearms. His face broke into a smile when he saw Elizabeth. "Miss Walker," he greeted her, helping her down from the wagon. "Welcome to my humble establishment." "It's hardly humble," Elizabeth replied, taking in the well-maintained buildings and fences. "It's quite impressive, Mr. Blackwood." "Quinn," he corrected gently. "Out here there's no need for such formality." Elizabeth hesitated, then nodded. "Quinn, then, and you must call me Elizabeth." "Elizabeth," he repeated, as if testing the name. His smile deepened. "Would you like the grand tour?" He showed her everything: the barn with its carefully designed stalls, the tack room with saddles and bridles hung in perfect order, the grain storage, the bunkhouse where Diego lived. Throughout it all, Elizabeth was struck by the obvious care and thought that had gone into every aspect of the ranch. "You've created something wonderful here," she told him as they walked toward the corral. "In such a short time, too." Quinn shook his head. "Been planning it for years. Had the designs drawn up in my head long before I ever set foot on this land." A large blue-gray dog bounded up to them, circling Quinn's legs before sitting attentively at his feet. "And this must be Blue," Elizabeth said, remembering Quinn's mention of his dog. "The very same. Best cattle dog in 3 territories." Quinn scratched the animal's ears affectionately. "Blue, this is Elizabeth. She's a friend." The word friend gave Elizabeth a strange pang. Was that all she was to Quinn, a friend? And why should that thought disappoint her? Blue approached Elizabeth cautiously, sniffing her skirts before allowing her to pat his head. "He's beautiful," she said, genuinely impressed by the intelligent eyes that assessed her. "He's particular about who he likes," Quinn observed, "but he seems to approve of you." They continued to the corral, where Quinn pointed out his prized horses, explaining the qualities he looked for in breeding stock. His knowledge was extensive, his passion evident in every word. Elizabeth found herself captivated not just by the information, but by the man himself, his hands gesturing expressively, his eyes alight with enthusiasm. "And this," he said, approaching a magnificent black stallion that stood apart from the others, "is Midnight, my pride and joy." The horse was spectacular, powerful, and sleek, with an intelligent gaze that seemed to take Elizabeth's measure. "He's magnificent," she breathed. "Would you like to meet him properly?" Before Elizabeth could answer, Quinn had opened the corral gate and was leading the great horse toward her. "Hold out your hand, palm flat," he instructed. "Let him get your scent." Elizabeth did as she was told, holding her breath as the stallion's velvety muzzle brushed against her palm. The sensation sent a shiver up her arm. "He likes you," Quinn said softly, standing close beside her. "He doesn't take to many people." "How can you tell?" His ears, "See how they're pointed forward, not back, and he's relaxed, not tense." Elizabeth felt a surge of pleasure at having earned the animal's approval. Would it be possible to ride him?" Quinn looked surprised. "You ride." "I grew up riding in Boston," Elizabeth explained. "My father kept horses before he died. It's been years, but I've missed it terribly." A slow smile spread across Quinn's face. "Midnight's a bit much for your first ride in years, but I have a mare who might suit you better." Within half an hour, Elizabeth found herself mounted on a gentle chestnut mare named Copper, riding alongside Quinn on midnight. They followed a trail that wound through Quinn's property, alongside a bubbling creek and through stands of cottonwood trees that gave the town its name. The feeling of being on horseback again was exhilarating. Elizabeth felt freer than she had in years, the rhythmic movement beneath her and the open sky above creating a sense of boundless possibility. "You ride well," Quinn commented as they paused to let the horses drink from the creek. "Most Eastern ladies I've met prefer carriages to saddles." "I've never been most ladies," Elizabeth replied with a small smile. "My father despaired of ever making a proper society woman of me." Quinn's gaze was warm as it rested on her face. "I'm glad he didn't succeed." The simple statement made Elizabeth's heart flutter. She looked away, watching the water ripple over stones in the creek bed. "Tell me about your family," she said, wanting to know more about him. "You mentioned your mother died when you were young." Quinn nodded, his expression growing more somber. "Ma died of fever when I was 8. Pa never really recovered. Took to drinking, gambling, lost our farm in Tennessee. We drifted west after that, working ranch to ranch." He paused, seeming to consider how much to share. "Pa died in a bar fight in Colorado when I was 16. I was on my own after that." "I'm so sorry," Elizabeth said softly, moved by the matter-of-fact way he related such painful memories. Quinn shrugged. "Made me who I am. Taught me what matters, working hard, keeping your word, building something that lasts." He looked around at his land, pride evident in his expression. "What about you? What brought you from Boston society to Wyoming Territory?" Elizabeth sighed, gathering her thoughts. "My parents died within a year of each other when I was 20. I became a teacher out of necessity, not choice, but I discovered I loved it." She hesitated, then continued, "As for coming west, that was James's idea. James being the fiancé who changed his mind." "Yes." "We corresponded for 4 years after meeting at a lecture in Boston. He came west first, wrote such beautiful letters about the opportunities here." Elizabeth shook her head, remembering her excitement, her naivete. "I sold everything to join him." Arrived to find a letter saying he'd reconsidered, that Wyoming was no place for a genteel Boston lady. Quinn's expression darkened. "Man's a fool." "Perhaps," Elizabeth acknowledged, "or perhaps he was right. I wasn't prepared for how difficult life is here." "And yet you stayed." Their eyes met across the small creek. "I stayed," Elizabeth confirmed quietly. Something shifted in Quinn's gaze, a softening, a deepening. "I'm glad you did." The air between them seemed to change, charged with unspoken feelings. Elizabeth found herself unable to look away from him, captivated by the genuine emotion in his face. The moment was broken by a distant rumble of thunder. Quinn glanced at the sky, where dark clouds were gathering on the horizon. "Storm's coming," he said, his voice rough. "We should head back." They rode swiftly back to the ranch, arriving just as the first fat raindrops began to fall. Quinn helped Elizabeth dismount, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. The touch sent warmth spreading through her despite the cooling air. "Let's get inside," he said, leading the way to the main house as the rain began to fall in earnest. The interior of Quinn's home surprised Elizabeth. She had expected a bachelor's Spartan quarters, but instead found a comfortable, well-furnished space. A stone fireplace dominated the main room, with a sturdy table and chairs to one side and a small sitting area arranged before the hearth. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with volumes that spoke of varied interests. "You have quite a library," Elizabeth observed, running her fingers along the spines of books ranging from agricultural texts to poetry collections. Quinn looked almost embarrassed. "Reading's a habit I picked up young, never broke it." "It's not a habit that needs breaking," Elizabeth replied, touched by this glimpse of his intellectual side. "These are wonderful choices." The rain was now coming down in sheets, drumming on the roof and streaming down the windows. Quinn moved to light the lamps as the sky darkened outside. "Afraid you might be stuck here a while," he said, glancing out at the downpour. These summer storms can pass quickly, but they're fierce while they last. I don't mind, Elizabeth said truthfully. She was enjoying this chance to see Quinn in his own space, to learn more about the man who had changed the course of her life with a simple act of kindness in an empty church. Quinn busied himself starting a fire against the sudden chill brought by the rain. Are you hungry? I could prepare something simple. Let me help, Elizabeth offered, following him to the small kitchen area. I'm not an accomplished cook, but I can certainly assist. Together they prepared a simple meal of beans, bacon, and cornbread. There was an easy companionship in their shared task, passing ingredients, working side by side at the small stove. Elizabeth found herself laughing more than she had in months as Quinn told stories of his early disastrous attempts at cooking for himself. Nearly burned down a bunkhouse trying to make biscuits, he admitted, his eyes crinkling with amusement. The foreman banned me from kitchen duty after that. As they sat down to eat at the sturdy wooden table, the storm raged outside, creating a cocoon of intimacy inside the warm, lamp-lit house. Elizabeth found herself telling Quinn stories of her own childhood adventures, teaching mishaps, dreams she'd harbored and set aside. I always wanted to write, she confessed over coffee after their meal. Stories, mostly, but it seemed impractical. Why impractical? Quinn asked, his expression genuinely curious. Elizabeth sighed. A woman needs security, teaching provides that in its way. But writing is what makes your eyes light up when you talk about it, Quinn observed quietly. Seems to me that matters. Elizabeth looked at him in surprise. No one had ever noticed or commented on her passion for writing before. Perhaps someday, she said softly, when I'm more settled. Outside, the storm was beginning to abate, the thunder now distant rumbles rather than overhead crashes. Elizabeth realized with a start that afternoon had given way to early evening. I should be getting back to town, she said reluctantly. Mrs. Holloway will worry, Quinn nodded, though he seemed as reluctant as she felt. I'll hitch the wagon. The ride back to Cottonwood Springs was peaceful, the land washed clean by the rain, the setting sun breaking through the dispersing clouds to cast everything in a golden glow. Quinn drove the wagon himself, with Diego following on horseback. They didn't speak much during the journey, but the silence was comfortable rather than awkward. Elizabeth found herself stealing glances at Quinn's profile, admiring the strong line of his jaw, the thoughtful set of his mouth. When they reached the boarding house, Quinn handed the reins to Diego and came around to help Elizabeth down. His hands were warm and strong as they encircled her waist, and for a breathless moment as she slid to the ground, their bodies were close enough that she could feel the solid strength of his chest. Thank you for today, she said, stepping back reluctantly. I enjoyed it immensely. Quinn's eyes were soft in the twilight, as did I. Perhaps we could do it again sometime. I'd like that very much. He hesitated, then reached out to touch her hand briefly. Good night, Elizabeth. Good night, Quinn. As Elizabeth watched him drive away, she felt a curious mixture of contentment and longing. The day had revealed so much about Quinn Blackwood, his kindness, his intelligence, his quiet strength. She found herself thinking of him not just as the man who had offered her a chance to stay in Cottonwood Springs, but as someone she wanted to know better, someone whose company she craved. The realization was both thrilling and terrifying. She had come west for one man and found her heart responding to another, a man as different from James as the Wyoming wilderness was from Boston's ordered streets. Mrs. Holloway was waiting in the parlor when Elizabeth entered. Had a nice day, did you? She asked, her tone carefully neutral. Yes, Elizabeth replied simply. Very nice indeed. As September gave way to October, Elizabeth settled into a rhythm in Cottonwood Springs. Her days were filled with teaching, her evenings with grading papers and preparing lessons. The children were progressing well, their initial wariness giving way to enthusiasm as Elizabeth introduced them to literature, mathematics, and natural sciences. She saw Quinn regularly, though not as often as she might have wished. He attended the town meetings that had begun to be held in the church after school hours, always sitting at the back, but contributing thoughtful suggestions when asked. Occasionally, he would appear at the end of the school day, offering to walk Elizabeth back to the boarding house or bringing some small gift, a book he thought she might enjoy, fresh apples from a tree on his property. Each encounter left Elizabeth more certain of her growing feelings for him, yet uncertain of his for her. He was unfailingly kind, attentive even, but maintained a careful distance that left her wondering if his interest was merely friendship or something more. As the first frost approached, the town began preparing for the Harvest Festival, a tradition that had nearly died out with Cottonwood Springs' decline, but was being revived with new enthusiasm. Elizabeth found herself on the planning committee alongside Mrs. Holloway, Mr. Peterson from the general store, and several other town stalwarts. "We need music," declared Mrs. Peterson during one meeting. "A proper dance. It's been too long since this town had cause for celebration." "Samuel plays the fiddle," someone suggested. "And the Cooper boys have a banjo and harmonica between them." "What about decorations?" Elizabeth asked, caught up in the growing excitement. "The children could help make them during art lessons." Ideas flowed freely, the townspeople showing more animation than Elizabeth had seen since her arrival. It was as if the school had breathed new life into Cottonwood Springs, giving its residents permission to hope again. The day before the festival, Elizabeth stayed late at the church, helping the older girls hang paper chains and autumn leaf garlands they had made. The door opened, bringing a gust of cool air, and Quinn Blackwood. "Looks festive in here," he commented, surveying the transformed space. Elizabeth smiled from her perch on a ladder where she was securing a garland to the rafters. "The children have worked so hard, I'm proud of them." Quinn moved to hold the ladder steady. "Careful there, wouldn't want our teacher taking a tumble before the big day." Elizabeth climbed down, suddenly aware of his proximity, the clean scent of soap and leather that accompanied him. "Will you be attending tomorrow? Wouldn't miss it." His eyes held hers for a moment longer than necessary. "Actually, I came to ask if you'd save a dance for me." Elizabeth's heart gave a little leap. "I'd be honored," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "Though I should warn you, it's been some time since I've danced." "Makes two of us," Quinn said with a small smile, "but I reckon we can manage not to trample each other's toes too badly." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the sound of the wind rattling the windows. Quinn seemed to be on the verge of saying something more when the church door opened again, admitting Mr. Peterson. "Evening, Quinn, Miss Walker," he greeted them. "Just bringing over the last of the lanterns for tomorrow." The moment was gone. Quinn tipped his hat to Elizabeth. "Until tomorrow, then?" "Yes, tomorrow," she echoed, watching him go with a curious sense of anticipation. The Harvest Festival exceeded everyone's expectations. The entire town turned out, along with families from the surrounding homesteads. The church was transformed, the pews pushed back to create space for dancing, tables laden with food along one wall, and lanterns casting a warm glow over everything. Elizabeth wore her best dress, a deep green wool with modest lace trim at the collar and cuffs. She had spent extra time on her hair, arranging it in a soft style that framed her face more flatteringly than her usual severe teaching knot. "You look lovely, Mrs. Holloway told her as they walked to the church together. "Certain to catch some gentleman's eye tonight," Elizabeth blushed. "I'm simply trying to represent the school well." Was Mrs. Holloway's skeptical response. "And I suppose Mr. Blackwood's presence has nothing to do with that extra touch of rouge on your cheeks." Before Elizabeth could formulate a denial, they arrived at the church, which was already filling with townspeople dressed in their finest. Children darted between adults, excited by the unusual evening activity. The makeshift band was tuning up in one corner, creating a cheerful cacophony. Elizabeth was immediately swept into her role as teacher, accepting compliments on the decorations and greeting parents. It was nearly an hour before she spotted Quinn, standing near the refreshment table in conversation with Samuel the blacksmith. He was dressed more formally than she had ever seen him, in a dark jacket and white shirt, his usually unruly hair tamed somewhat for the occasion. He looked handsome in a rugged way that made Elizabeth's pulse quicken. As if sensing her gaze, Quinn looked up, his eyes finding hers across the crowded room. A smile spread across his face, and he excused himself from Samuel to make his way toward her. "Miss Walker," he greeted her formally, though his eyes held a warmth that was anything but formal. "You look beautiful tonight." "Thank you," Elizabeth replied, feeling unaccountably shy. "You're looking quite distinguished yourself." Before Quinn could respond, the band struck up a lively tune and couples began moving to the center of the room for the first dance. "I believe you promised me a dance," Quinn said, offering his hand. Elizabeth placed her fingers in his, feeling a jolt of awareness at the contact. "So I did." Quinn led her to the makeshift dance floor, placing one hand respectfully at her waist while maintaining proper distance between their bodies. As they began to move to the music, Elizabeth was pleasantly surprised by his skill. "You dance very well for a man who claimed to be out of practice," she observed. A hint of mischief appeared in Quinn's eyes. "Maybe I just wanted to lower your expectations." Elizabeth laughed, relaxing into the dance. A strategic approach. They moved together with unexpected grace, finding a natural rhythm that made Elizabeth feel as if they had danced together many times before. As the music continued, she became increasingly aware of Quinn's hand at her waist, the occasional brush of their bodies as they turned, the intensity in his gaze when their eyes met. When the dance ended, Elizabeth found herself reluctant to step away. Quinn seemed equally hesitant, his hand lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. "Would you like some punch?" he asked, his voice slightly rougher than usual. "Yes, thank you." He led her to the refreshment table, his hand resting lightly at the small of her back. The simple gesture felt possessive in a way that sent a thrill through Elizabeth. They found a relatively quiet corner to enjoy their punch, watching the dancers while exchanging observations about the townspeople. "Mrs. Cooper has been eyeing us since our dance," Elizabeth noted with amusement. "I suspect we'll be the subject of tomorrow's gossip." Quinn's expression grew more serious. "Does that bother you?" Elizabeth considered the question. "It should, perhaps. A teacher must maintain a certain reputation, but, Quinn prompted when she hesitated. "But I find I don't particularly care what Mrs. Cooper thinks," Elizabeth admitted. "Not when I'm enjoying myself so thoroughly." The smile that spread across Quinn's face made her heart flip. "I'm glad to hear it," he said softly, "because I'd very much like to dance with you again." They danced twice more that evening, each time moving a little closer, their conversation flowing more easily. By the final dance, a slower, more intimate tune, Elizabeth could feel the solid warmth of Quinn's chest against her own, his breath stirring the wisps of hair near her temple. "Elizabeth," he murmured, so quietly that only she could hear. "There's something I've been wanting to tell you." Her heart began to race. "Yes." Before Quinn could continue, a commotion at the church entrance interrupted the moment. A man staggered in, his clothes travel-stained, his face haggard. "Fire!" he shouted. "The Morrison place is burning. Need every man who can ride." The festive atmosphere evaporated instantly. Men began rushing for the door, women gathering children and organizing supplies. Quinn's expression shifted from tender to alert in an instant. "I have to go," he told Elizabeth, already moving toward the door. "The Morrisons have 3 young children." "Of course," Elizabeth replied, though disappointment flooded her. "Be careful." Quinn paused, then quickly took her hand and pressed it to his lips. "We'll finish our conversation another time," he promised, his eyes intense. Then he was gone, rushing out with the other men to help fight the fire. Elizabeth stood in the suddenly half-empty church, her hand still tingling from the touch of Quinn's lips, her mind filled with questions about what he had been about to say. Around her, the remaining townspeople were organizing themselves, gathering blankets for the Morrison family, preparing food and coffee for the men who would return exhausted from fighting the fire. Mrs. Holloway appeared at Elizabeth's side. "No use standing there mooning, girl. There's work to be done." Elizabeth nodded, pushing aside her personal feelings to focus on the crisis at hand. Yet as she helped prepare supplies, she couldn't help wondering what Quinn had wanted to tell her and when she would have the chance to hear it. The fire at the Morrison farm had destroyed the barn and damaged part of the main house, but thanks to the quick response from the men of Cottonwood Springs, the family was safe and much of their property salvaged. In the days that followed, the town rallied around them, providing shelter, food, and helping hands to begin rebuilding before winter set in. Elizabeth saw little of Quinn during this time. He was often at the Morrison place, using his carpentry skills to help with the reconstruction. When their paths did cross, it was usually in the company of others, allowing no opportunity for the private conversation he had promised. October gave way to November, bringing colder temperatures and the first light snowfall. Elizabeth added lessons on weather patterns and winter survival to her curriculum, aware that many of her students would face challenging months ahead. One Friday afternoon, as school was dismissing, Elizabeth looked up to see Quinn standing in the doorway. Her heart gave its now familiar leap at the sight of him. "Mr. Blackwood," she greeted him, conscious of the few lingering students. "What brings you to town today?" "Business at the general store," he replied, stepping into the room as the last children departed. "And I wanted to see if you might be free for a ride tomorrow. Weather's supposed to be clear, might be one of the last good days before winter truly sets in." "I'd like that very much," Elizabeth said, perhaps too quickly. "What time shall I expect you?" "Mid-morning, say 10 o'clock. "Perfect." Quinn hesitated, glancing around the empty classroom. "About the Harvest Festival, what I was going to say before we were interrupted." Elizabeth's pulse quickened. "Yes." He took a step closer, his expression earnest. "I've been trying to find the right moment to tell you that." The church door banged open, and Olivia burst in. "Miss Walker, Aunt says to remind you about the quilting circle tonight. She's afraid you'll forget and stay late grading papers again." Quinn stepped back, his expression shifting to a carefully neutral smile. "I should let you go. Tomorrow at 10 then?" "Yes," Elizabeth agreed, hiding her frustration at the second interruption. "I'll be ready." That night, Elizabeth found sleep elusive, her mind too full of Quinn Blackwood and what he might have been trying to tell her. Twice now he had been on the verge of saying something important, and twice they had been interrupted. Was it possible he shared the feelings that had been growing in her heart? Or was she reading too much into his friendly attentions? Morning brought clear skies and sunshine that belied the crisp November air. Elizabeth dressed warmly in her sturdiest skirt and a wool jacket, with a knitted scarf and gloves against the chill. She was waiting on the boarding house porch when Quinn arrived precisely at 10, mounted on Midnight with Copper on a lead rope beside him. "Good morning," he called, his breath visible in the cold air. "Ready for an adventure?" Elizabeth smiled, her earlier uncertainties fading at the sight of him. "Always." Quinn dismounted to help her onto Copper, his hands strong and sure at her waist. The mare whinnied in recognition, nudging Elizabeth's arm affectionately. "She remembers you," Quinn observed. "Been saving her for you. Haven't let anyone else ride her since your visit." The simple statement warmed Elizabeth more than her wool jacket. They set off at an easy pace, following a different trail than they had during her visit to the ranch. "Where are we going?" Elizabeth asked, enjoying the familiar feel of being on horseback again. "There's a place I want to show you," Quinn replied. "About an hour's ride." "Worth the journey, I promise." They rode side by side where the trail permitted, talking easily about the events of the past weeks, the Morrison family's recovery, the progress of Elizabeth's students, Quinn's horses. As they climbed higher into the foothills, the landscape opened up around them, revealing vistas that took Elizabeth's breath away. "It's beautiful," she said, pausing to admire the view of the valley below, where Cottonwood Springs was just visible as a tiny cluster of buildings beside the silver thread of the creek. "This isn't even the best part," Quinn promised. "Just a little further." They continued up the trail until it opened suddenly onto a small plateau. A clear mountain lake spread before them, its surface reflecting the deep blue of the sky and the surrounding pines. At the far end, a small waterfall tumbled down a rocky face, the sound of splashing water carrying clearly in the still air. "Oh, Quinn," Elizabeth breathed, pulling Copper to a stop. "It's magnificent." Quinn dismounted and helped Elizabeth down, his hands lingering at her waist. "Found it by accident my first month here, been coming back ever since when I need to think." "And what do you think about?" Elizabeth asked softly, looking up at him. Quinn's eyes held hers, intense and searching. "Lately, mostly you." The simple admission sent a wave of warmth through Elizabeth despite the chill air. "Me, you," Quinn confirmed, one hand rising to gently touch her cheek. "The way you've brought life back to Cottonwood Springs, the way you believe in those children, the way you make me feel when you're near." Elizabeth's heart was pounding so hard she was certain he must hear it. "And how do I make you feel?" "Like I've found something I wasn't even sure existed." Quinn's voice was low, rough with emotion. "Like maybe there's more to life than just building a ranch and raising horses." He took a deep breath, his gaze never leaving hers. "Elizabeth, I know you came west for another man, I know your heart was broken, and I know it hasn't been that long since we met. But I find myself thinking about you all the time, wondering what you're teaching the children, if you're warm enough in that drafty church, what book you're reading at night." Quinn's hand gently cradled her face. "I didn't expect to feel this way, didn't think I was looking for it. But there you were, crying in that empty church, and something in me recognized something in you, and every day since, that feeling has only grown stronger." Elizabeth felt tears gathering in her eyes, not of sadness but of overwhelming emotion. "Quinn." "You don't have to say anything now," he hastened to add. "I know it might be too soon. I just couldn't bear another interruption before I told you how I feel." Elizabeth raised her hand to cover his where it rested against her cheek. "It's not too soon," she whispered. "Not for me." Hope flared in Quinn's eyes. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that James breaking our engagement was the best thing that ever happened to me," Elizabeth replied, her voice growing stronger. "Because it led me to Cottonwood Springs, to those children, to you." She stepped closer to him, close enough to feel the warmth of his body. "I've been falling in love with you since that first day in the church, when you sat beside me and told me you believed in me. No one had ever said that to me before." Quinn's expression transformed, joy breaking across his features like sunrise. "Elizabeth," he murmured, her name a caress on his lips. Then he was drawing her to him, one arm encircling her waist while his other hand still cradled her face. Their first kiss was gentle, questioning, a soft press of lips that asked permission. Elizabeth answered by sliding her arms around his neck, rising on tiptoe to deepen the contact. Quinn responded instantly, pulling her closer, his mouth moving against hers with growing passion. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing hard, their breath mingling in visible puffs in the cold air. Quinn rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed as if savoring the moment. "I've been wanting to do that since the Harvest Festival," he admitted. "Maybe even before." Elizabeth smiled, feeling lighter than she had in years. "I believe I've been waiting for you to do that for just as long," Quinn laughed, the sound echoing across the lake. "We've wasted too much time already then." He kissed her again, more confidently this time, his arms strong around her, making her feel cherished and desired all at once. Elizabeth melted into him, all thoughts of propriety forgotten in the joy of finally expressing the feelings that had been building between them. They spent the afternoon by the lake, talking, kissing, sharing dreams and memories. Quinn spread a blanket on a sun-warmed rock, and they sat close together, his arm around her shoulders as they watched the play of light on the water. "I never expected to find this," Elizabeth confessed, her head resting against his shoulder. "When I came west, I thought I knew what my future held: marriage to James, perhaps children, a proper Boston gentleman's wife transplanted to Wyoming." "Are you disappointed with how things turned out instead?" Quinn asked, a hint of vulnerability in his question. Elizabeth lifted her head to look at him directly. "Not for a moment. That life would have been secure, perhaps, but it would never have made me truly happy. James didn't know me, not really. He never asked about my dreams or noticed what made my eyes light up." She touched Quinn's face, tracing the scar along his jawline. "You really saw me from that first day, the real me, not some idea of what a proper lady should be." Quinn turned his head to kiss her palm. "I think maybe we recognized each other. Two people who didn't quite fit the molds others tried to put us in." As the afternoon waned and the air grew colder, they reluctantly prepared to return to town. Quinn helped Elizabeth back onto Copper, sealing the assistance with a kiss that left her blushing. "Mrs. Holloway will have plenty to say if she sees that," Elizabeth teased, adjusting her scarf to hide the flush in her cheeks. Quinn grinned unrepentantly as he mounted Midnight. "Reckon the whole town will be talking by tomorrow anyway. I'm not planning to hide how I feel about you, Elizabeth, not unless you want me to." "No," she replied firmly. "No more hiding. Life is too short for that." They rode back toward Cottonwood Springs side by side, their horses matching pace naturally, just as they had found their own natural rhythm together. As the town came into view in the valley below, Elizabeth felt a sense of rightness, of coming home not to a place, but to a person. Quinn reached across the space between them to take her hand. "I love you, Elizabeth Walker," he said simply. "Have since that day in the church, though I didn't know it then." Elizabeth's heart swelled with joy. "And I love you, Quinn Blackwood, with all my heart." The winter of 1879–1880 proved to be one of the harshest in Wyoming Territory's memory. Snow fell early and often, piling into drifts that made travel between outlying homesteads and Cottonwood Springs nearly impossible for weeks at a time. The school remained open, though attendance fluctuated with the weather and the children's ability to make the journey safely. Despite the challenges, Elizabeth found it to be the happiest winter of her life. Her relationship with Quinn blossomed despite the difficult conditions. On days when he couldn't make it to town, he would send Diego with notes tucked inside packages of supplies for the school, heartfelt messages that Elizabeth treasured, reading them by lamplight in her room at Mrs. Holloway's. When travel was possible, Quinn would arrive at the church after school hours to help with repairs, to listen as Elizabeth read aloud to him from her favorite books, or simply to be near her. Their courtship progressed under the watchful but increasingly approving eyes of the townspeople, who had come to respect both the Boston teacher and the rancher who had breathed new life into the old Bradley place. Christmas brought a brief respite from the winter's fury. The church was decorated with pine boughs and candles, and the children performed a nativity play that drew every resident of Cottonwood Springs regardless of their usual church attendance. Elizabeth directed the performance, swelling with pride as her pupils remembered their lines and sang the carols she had taught them. Afterward, Quinn found her in the makeshift classroom, where she was gathering up costumes and props. "They were wonderful," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "You've done amazing things with them in just a few months." Elizabeth smiled, pushing a strand of hair back from her face. "They did all the work, I just provided the opportunity." Quinn crossed the room to her, taking the shepherd's crook she was holding and setting it aside. "You're too modest. This town was dying before you arrived. Now look at it: children learning, people gathering, planning for the future instead of just surviving the present." He took both her hands in his. "You've made me think about the future too." Elizabeth's heart quickened at his tone. "Have I?" "You know I'm not a man for fancy words," Quinn began, his thumbs tracing circles on her palms. "But I know what I want, and that's a life with you in it. Every day." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small box. "This was my mother's," he said, opening it to reveal a simple gold band set with a small pearl. She made my father promise that someday I would have it, to give to the woman I chose to spend my life with. Elizabeth felt tears gathering in her eyes as Quinn dropped to one knee before her. Elizabeth Walker, will you marry me? Will you build a life with me, raise children with me, grow old with me? I can't promise it will always be easy out here, but I can promise to love you every day of my life. Yes, Elizabeth whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Yes, Quinn, I will marry you. Quinn's face lit with joy as he slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her hand. He rose and gathered her into his arms, kissing her with a passion that left her breathless. When? He asked when they finally broke apart. How soon can you be my wife? Elizabeth laughed, giddy with happiness. We should wait until spring at least, when travel is easier and everyone can attend. Quinn groaned in mock disappointment. That's months away. Worth waiting for, Elizabeth teased, touching his face tenderly. Besides, it will give us time to prepare properly. I want to make a home with you, not just rush into marriage. You're right, as usual, Quinn conceded, pressing his forehead to hers. But know that I'll be counting the days. Their engagement was celebrated throughout Cottonwood Springs. Mrs. Holloway insisted on hosting a small party at the boarding house, where the couple received congratulations and well wishes from the entire town. Elizabeth was touched by how fully she had been accepted into this community that had seemed so foreign to her just months before. As winter slowly released its grip on the land, Elizabeth and Quinn began making plans for their future together. They decided that after their wedding, Elizabeth would move to the ranch but continue teaching in town. Quinn added a small study to the house for her, with built-in bookshelves and a desk placed to catch the morning light, a place where she could write the stories she had always dreamed of creating. You need somewhere to pursue your own dreams, he told her when he showed her the plans. Teaching is important, but I want you to have space for everything that matters to you. The thoughtfulness of the gesture brought tears to Elizabeth's eyes. How did I get so lucky? She wondered aloud. Quinn pulled her close. I ask myself the same question every day. Their wedding was set for the first Saturday in May, when the wildflowers would be blooming across the prairie and the worst of the spring mud would have dried. Elizabeth wrote to her few remaining friends in Boston, inviting them to the ceremony, though she knew the journey would prevent most from attending. To her surprise, her former headmistress replied that she would indeed make the trip, to see for myself the Wyoming that has captured my most promising teacher. As the wedding day approached, Elizabeth found herself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this point. A year ago, she had been preparing to travel west to marry a man she had thought she loved. Now she was about to wed a very different man, one who had seen her at her lowest moment and had offered not pity but belief in her strength. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and mild, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of new growth across the plains. Elizabeth dressed in a gown of ivory silk that Mrs. Holloway and the town's women had helped her make, trimmed with lace she had brought from Boston. Olivia arranged her hair, weaving wildflowers through the auburn strands. You look beautiful, said a voice from the doorway. Elizabeth turned to see her former headmistress, Mrs. Crawford, watching with approval. Your young man is a fortunate fellow. Thank you for coming all this way, Elizabeth said, embracing the older woman. It means more than I can say. Mrs. Crawford held her at arm's length, studying her face. I came expecting to find you making the best of difficult circumstances. Instead, I find you positively glowing with happiness. This place suits you, Elizabeth. It does, she agreed. Or perhaps it's the people. Quinn, the children, this town, they've become my home in a way Boston never quite was. Then I shall return east with my mind at ease, Mrs. Crawford declared. Now, I believe there's a church full of people waiting for you. The church had been transformed once again, this time with garlands of wildflowers and ribbons. Every resident of Cottonwood Springs and the surrounding homesteads had crowded into the small building, along with ranchers and traders from as far as 20 miles away, all come to witness the union of the teacher who had revitalized their community and the rancher who had become one of its most respected members. Quinn waited at the front of the church, looking uncharacteristically nervous in a new black suit. Diego stood beside him as best man, grinning widely. When the door opened and Elizabeth appeared on the arm of Mr. Peterson, who had offered to give her away in the absence of her father, Quinn's expression transformed. The love and wonder in his eyes as he watched her walk toward him was all the reassurance Elizabeth needed that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The ceremony was simple but deeply meaningful. They exchanged vows they had written themselves, promises to support each other's dreams, to face life's challenges together, to build a home filled with love and learning. "I once told you that abandoned things still have value," Quinn said, as he slipped the wedding band onto Elizabeth's finger. "What I didn't say was that finding value in what others have overlooked is the greatest gift one person can give another. You saw value in a dying town, in children others had written off as just ranch hands and farmers' wives in training. And somehow, you saw value in a rough cowboy with more dreams than accomplishments." He took both her hands in his. "I promise to spend my life seeing you, all of you, the teacher, the writer, the woman who cries in empty churches and the one who stands up to blizzards without flinching. I promise to believe in you every day in all ways, for as long as I live." Elizabeth's voice shook with emotion as she made her own vows. "I came west believing I knew what my future held, only to find everything I thought I wanted slipping away. In that moment of despair, you sat beside me and offered not empty comfort, but a challenge to believe in myself as much as you believed in me." She squeezed his hands. "I promise to be that same voice for you to believe in your dreams as fiercely as you've believed in mine, to build a life with you that honors both our pasts and the future we'll create together. I promise to love you through all seasons, Quinn Blackwood, with every beat of my heart." The kiss that sealed their vows was met with cheers and applause that seemed to lift the very roof of the old church. As they turned to face their friends and neighbors as husband and wife, Elizabeth felt a sense of completion, not an ending, but the beginning of a journey she couldn't wait to take with the man beside her. The celebration continued well into the evening, with food and dancing and more laughter than Cottonwood Springs had heard in many years. As dusk fell, Quinn and Elizabeth slipped away, mounting midnight and copper for the ride to their home now, not just Quinn's. They rode side by side in the gathering darkness, the first stars appearing overhead. Neither spoke much, content in the knowledge that they had all the time in the world now for conversations both profound and mundane. As they crested the final rise before the ranch, Quinn pulled midnight to a halt. Elizabeth stopped beside him, looking at him questioningly. "I just want to remember this moment," he explained softly. "You, in your wedding dress on copper with our home waiting below and the whole future ahead of us." Elizabeth reached across to take his hand. "It's just the beginning," she promised. "The best is yet to come." And as they rode down toward the warm lights of the ranch house where Blue waited to greet them, where the study with its empty shelves and blank pages awaited Elizabeth's stories, where they would someday bring children to raise in the fresh air and freedom of Wyoming, Elizabeth knew it was true. What had begun with tears in an empty church had blossomed into a love and a life fuller than she had ever dared to dream. 5 years later, 1884, the sound of children's laughter floated through the open windows of the Blackwood ranch house, carried on the warm June breeze. Elizabeth looked up from the manuscript she was revising, a smile forming automatically at the familiar sound. Setting aside her pen, she rose from the desk in her study and moved to the window. In the yard below, Quinn was on his hands and knees, their 3-year-old son Thomas on his back, clinging to his father's shirt and shrieking with delight as Quinn pretended to be a wild Mustang. Nearby, their 5-year-old daughter Margaret sat on a blanket in the shade, solemnly reading to her rag doll from one of Elizabeth's old schoolbooks. The sight of her family at play made Elizabeth's heart swell with contentment. 5 years of marriage had only deepened her love for Quinn, each challenge they faced together strengthening the bond between them. The ranch had prospered under Quinn's careful management, his breeding program producing horses sought after throughout the territory. Elizabeth had continued teaching in Cottonwood Springs until Margaret's birth, and now conducted smaller lessons at the ranch for their children and those of nearby homesteaders. And she wrote, "Every morning before the household stirred, and in stolen moments throughout the day, Elizabeth crafted the stories that had lived in her heart since childhood." Quinn had been her first reader, his honest feedback and unwavering encouragement giving her the confidence to send her work to publishers back east. Last month, she had received word that her collection of frontier tales would be published in the coming year, a dream realized that once would have seemed impossible. Cottonwood Springs had changed too, growing slowly but steadily as word spread of good grazing land and a community that valued education. The church now served as a proper schoolhouse during the week, with a dedicated teacher who had trained under Elizabeth. New businesses had opened a proper restaurant, a second general store, even a small hotel to accommodate travelers and potential settlers. Elizabeth was so lost in reflection that she didn't hear Quinn enter the house until his arms slipped around her waist from behind. "What's got you looking so thoughtful, Mrs. Blackwood?" he murmured, pressing a kiss to her neck. Elizabeth leaned back against him, savoring his solid warmth. "Just counting my blessings." Quinn turned her in his arms to face him. At 35, he was more handsome than ever, the years adding character to his face rather than just lines. His eyes still held that same steady belief in her that had first captured her heart. "Any particular blessings you're especially grateful for today?" he asked, a playful note in his voice. Elizabeth pretended to consider. "Well, the children are healthy, the ranch is thriving, my book will be published next year. Anything else?" Quinn prompted, his hands tightening slightly at her waist. Elizabeth's smile widened. "And there's this cowboy I'm rather fond of. Has a habit of saying exactly the right thing at exactly the right moment." "Is that so?" Quinn's expression grew more serious, though his eyes still held their warmth. "Like the time he found a beautiful woman crying in an empty church and told her he believed in her." "Especially then," Elizabeth confirmed softly. "That moment changed everything." Quinn brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch as tender as it had been on their wedding day. "I meant every word, still do." "I know." Elizabeth raised her hand to his cheek. "And I've tried to be worthy of that belief every day since. You've been that and more." Quinn's voice roughened with emotion. "When I think of how close I came to not riding into town that day," Elizabeth silenced him with a gentle kiss. "But you did, and here we are." From the yard came the sound of Thomas calling for his father, impatient for the game to continue. Quinn smiled against Elizabeth's lips. "Duty calls," he murmured. "Will you join us? Margaret's been asking for a story." "Of course." Elizabeth took his hand as they walked together toward the door. "I have the perfect one in mind." "Oh," Quinn raised an eyebrow. "What's it about?" Elizabeth's eyes twinkled as she looked up at the man who had transformed her life with a simple act of kindness and faith. "It's about a woman who was crying in an empty church until a cowboy sat beside her and said, 'I believe in you,' and how those words led to the greatest adventure of her life." Quinn's smile was as bright as the Wyoming sun overhead. "That sounds like a story worth telling." "It is," Elizabeth agreed, squeezing his hand. "And the best part is we're still writing it together every day." As they stepped out into the sunlight to join their children, Elizabeth sent up a silent prayer of gratitude for broken engagements and empty churches, for cowboys with kind eyes and unwavering faith, and for the courage to believe that sometimes what looks like an ending is really just the beginning of something far more beautiful than you ever dared to dream.